Okay, Chapter 30, The War to End War, 1917 to 1918. History fair is over. February is here. We can get back to doing the lectures of these chapters, and there's not a whole lot left, to be honest with you. There's 42 chapters in the book. The last two chapters are kind of wishy-washy chapters anyway. So really, this is kind of the last quarter of the book to get through, and in a lot of ways, it's the most fun part of the book because it's all 20th century stuff with all the wars and all the scandals and the big events and assassinations and stuff like that that happened. So, how did the war start as far as America is concerned? And growing up, you probably heard about the Lusitania, the sinking of the Lusitania, and that was published a lot, but that really wasn't the cause of the United States going into war because it was sunk in May 1915. Now, we don't end up going to war until April of 1917. So it really it was very highly publicized. And then as the war movement slowly built up in 15 and 16, they kept harkening back to discussing that Germany had done this and killed so many Americans. What really started it all was when Germany announced on January 31st, 1917, that they would wage unrestricted submarine warfare in the war zone. So basically, any type of American ship that would go towards Great Britain, whether it be sending passengers or armaments, that it would be sunk. And then right around the same time, on March 1st, 1917, we intercepted and published something called the Zimmermann Note. And it was a secret letter from the German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico, of all places, and he was proposing a German-Mexican alliance. And if Mexico would invade the United States, uh, that they would then get the land that they had lost in the Mexican-American War 60, 70 years before that. So we narrowly averted the much vaunted German-Mexican alliance. And so eventually Woodrow Wilson asks Congress to declare war, because remember, Congress has that power, not the president, on April 2nd, 1917, and Congress does indeed declare war on April 6th. It was not unanimous. There was a healthy amount of dissent, and it ends up being a fairly unpopular war, both before the war, during the war, and definitely after the war. This is just a picture from your book. Um, on the day that President Wilson asked for the declaration of war, and he proclaimed that America was on a crusade to make the world safe for democracy, which is total BS given what we now know of Woodrow Wilson. You know, his views on African Americans aside, right? This is the guy that his main hobby was invading Latin American countries to topple their governments and to set up American puppet states. So who he's not making the world safe, and he doesn't believe in democracy. So the guy was an absolute lying hypocrite, one of the worst presidents of all time. Wilson, as part of his hypocrisy, right, he had something that's called the 14 points. Right, Wilson's 14 points. They were like the war aims. They were also used as bargaining chips to try and lure the Entente powers and the Allies, the Axis powers, I'm sorry, to um, stop fighting. So some of the highlights, you don't have to memorize all 14. Really, the only one, the most important one's at the bottom there. But abolish secret treaties, freedom of the seas, so you can't just be a bully because you got a bigger navy. Removal of economic barriers, so this would be the destruction of tariffs and trade agreements. The reduction of armaments, so everybody decrease the size of your navies and your armies and stuff like that. An adjustment of colonial aims. This one was very, very vague. It was vague because we had our own colonial aims. But in other words, nationalism. Try and treat people of a certain ethnicity that they should have their own country, and if they can't have their own country, then a certain amount of autonomy. Evacuation of foreign troops from Russia, Belgium, and France. Of course, that's where the Germans were. Creation of an independent Poland, because it had been kind of under the thumb of its bigger neighbors, Russia and Germany, for hundreds of years. And lastly, and most importantly, the creation of a League of Nations. So this would be a international organization, like a governing body that would deal with conflicts hopefully peacefully, arbitrate them, mediate them, and try and avert future conflicts. So then the American government has to try and sell this war to the American public. And you have to do two things, right? You need soldiers to fight in this war, and you need money to fund the war. So that can be a tough bill to sell. So they created the Committee on Public Information. It was headed by a guy by the name of George Creel, and the goal was to create propaganda to sell America on the war. And Creel did a fantastic job, actually. He some of the all-time best war propaganda posters that you'll ever see are from this time period. And if you're in class, I'm probably going to show you a good dozen, 2 dozen more of these posters, just because they're so awesome. Here's some more posters. The iconic Uncle Sam, I Want You for the U.S. Army. You can see there on the left. Here's another one that this just ordinary businessman reads in the paper, Huns kill women and children, and he instantly rips off his jacket and apparently becomes a Marine. Stifling loyalty, or enforcing loyalty and stifling dissent. So if you remember all the way back to 1800, there was the Alien and Sedition Acts. We essentially have another Alien Sedition Acts that are passed in 1917, 1918. And it's meant, and as you can understand the motivations for it. You're trying to stop people from harming the war effort because wars are so critical to a nation's survival, and so you don't want anybody trying to interfere with that. However, we have this thing that called the Constitution, specifically the First Amendment, which gives people civil liberties and protections that they're allowed to say whatever they want, and this conflicts with those. So what usually happens in these cases, and you can even talk about the Patriot Act and the aftermath of 9/11, is Congress kind of goes overboard, tries to protect the war effort by passing these laws, which are later found to violate the Constitution. So here we go. Espionage Act of 1917. It forbade actions that obstructed recruitment or efforts to promote insubordination in the military. Ordered the Postmaster General to remove leftist materials from the mail. So if you were, we'll say, an international workers of the world, the Wobblies, and you're sending out leaflets saying for people to avoid the draft or not work as hard because their job now supports the war effort, they would be in violation of this Espionage Act. And you can see you could get a fine of up to $10,000 or 20 years in prison. And lots of socialists were imprisoned for this. The biggest one is Eugene Debs, who he was in jail for about 10 years or so, I think. Then there was the Sedition Act. It even has the same name as the one from the John Adams administration. It was a crime to speak against the purchase of war bonds, so you couldn't even, advise people or advertise that people should not buy war bonds. Willfully utter, print, write, or publish any disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language about this form of the U.S. government, the U.S. Constitution, or the U.S. Armed Forces. I mean, you could basically anything negative, or that could even be perceived as negative about the government, the Constitution, or the military, you could be found in violation of the Sedition Act. So, this is a very, very famous case, Schenck versus United States. We are actually going to read it next year in AP Government, but for different purposes. We're reading it next year for First Amendment type purposes for civil liberties. I'm going to talk about it now for the World War One component to it. And so it was just a mailing that was sent out that was like anti-draft. That's it. right? It was that we're murdering innocent Germans, blah 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 blah. Avoid the draft, that type of thing. And nowadays, that would be protected under the First Amendment. In the opinion, so this guy is arrested for it, and it goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And it has here, it's in blue. The blue font is the most important, where the Supreme Court stated that the protection of free speech does not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater. That causes a panic, and of course the people could be trampled to death. And so then the test becomes, if you say something that poses a clear and present danger to the health and welfare of others, then Congress has the power to say that you can't do that. And in this case, because you need soldiers to fight in a war, and we needed to have a draft to get enough soldiers, that if you speak out against the draft, that is a clear and present danger to the health of basically our soldiers, because there apparently wouldn't be enough of them to fight. So that's the analysis. You can see that just the fear that's going on amongst the government to try and do everything they possibly can to support the war effort at this point. We're going to talk more about women in the war effort for World War II, but there is some stuff to talk about for World War I, and that's that they go into the factories. They still were not allowed in active combat roles, but they're starting to get secretary positions and stuff like that in the military. They also grew what are called victory gardens and engaged in kind of voluntary rationing at home and stuff like that. And it really, it pushes forward the suffrage movement, the right to vote. And it's not just in America. You can see on the table on the right side there that this is the time period when most of the countries, the modern industrialized countries, are giving women the right to vote. You can see it starts with New Zealand in 1893, and then you get Australia, Finland, Denmark, Iceland, and then right around the same time that the war ends here, you see Austria, Canada, Germany, Hungary, Poland, Russia, United Kingdom, then 1919 Netherlands and Sweden, and then in 1920 us. Now, you can see at the bottom there are some countries, especially in the Middle East, that did not give women the right to vote for a very, very long time. The most recent one being Kuwait in 2005. So America finally, remember we started this lecture where they had we declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917. There's pretty much an entire year there that goes by without us actually doing any fighting. It takes us almost an entire year to ramp up our war effort, which is pretty dumb on our parts because we knew we were going to get sucked in for a couple years before that. You would have thought we should have prepared better, but it probably ends up saving lots of American lives, as we'll talk about. What really kind of forces us to send the soldiers over there, though, is the Russian Revolution. You remember last year from world history that the Bolsheviks topple the Tsar and the Russian government in late 1917, and basically the Russian soldiers they stop fighting on the Eastern Front because they got to deal with the civil war that's going on. And when the Bolsheviks pretty much win in early 1918, they sign a hasty treaty with Germany where they give Germany massive amounts of land, but they pull out, and so Germany then doesn't have to fight a two-front war, which is very, very difficult. And they're able to pull hundreds of thousands of German soldiers from the Eastern Front and actually send them to the Western Front to try and tip the balance, which had been stalemate for years on the Western Front, and to a final push to try and envelop France with the goal of capturing Paris. So America goes in there to stop them, and you can see you're not just fighting the Huns, but you're fighting the whores, and it's something that soldiers have dealt with probably for thousands of years, and for the first time, it starts to get publicized a little bit because these soldiers are they're getting sick from these ladies of the evening, and so as part of the Creole propaganda machine, uh, they try and stamp out venereal diseases among soldiers. So this is a map of basically the war in 1918 and what's going on, and you can see this ends up being the armistice line. So this is the line that the countries are at and that they agree to end their fighting at when the war ends in November 1918. But prior to that, the front line had been here pretty much for 3 years, right? So the war starts in 1914. Germany invades, right? They do the Schlieffen Plan, which you learned about last year, and then it turns into stalemate at this point. Then you can see after Russia pulls out and the Germans engage in a spring offensive, this is where the offensive begins. So they attack Flanders at Ypres. They attack at Cantigny here. There's the Belleau Wood, and there's a couple battles of the Marne that happen here. There's the Battle of Saint Mihiel, and whatever this word is, Meuse Argonne. And really, America really intensely fights. We kind of get this flank here, so all the way the line from Switzerland all the way to about here or so. And so most of the American fighting in 1918 is here. Although we did fight in support of the other countries over here, but this is more of France and Britain battle lines, and this is more of the American. And you can see that these are intense fighting. This is a deadlock battle. These are all Allied victories. Eventually, the Germans have just extended themselves for too long. They've fought for too long. They've lost too many soldiers, and they can't sustain the offensive. There's just too many enemies against them. So at the end of the day, after Germany signs the armistice, you get the final tally, the back of the baseball card statistics of men killed in battle. This is just in battle now. Russia loses almost 2 million. Germany loses 1.6 million. France loses almost 4 million. British Empire loses almost 1 million. Austria 800,000. Italy 462,000. The United States only loses 53,000 men, and that it sounds like a small amount, except that when you figure that's 53,000 men that died. But relatively speaking, compared to the other combatants, it's a far lower number. And you're going to see the same thing in World War II. Europe is they lose whole generations of young men in World War I, World War II, and America comes out relatively unscathed. Now, this number is far lower. At the end of the day, this amounts to about 9 million soldiers that die, but it's a much higher number. Tens of millions of men die from disease. There's the Spanish flu that happens during this time period that spreads around the world, basically because of the returning soldiers from World War I, that kills tens of millions of people around the world. It really is it's a horrible pandemic. So there I have here, and it's from your book. Germany gave up. They signed the armistice on the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918. So it kind of ruins the poeticness of the statement. And then you have a very prophetic poster there, or political cartoon, I should say, that was made around this time period, and it has here, "Well, it didn't pay," and then the other guy goes, "Not this time," and it's kind of eerie because in a few chapters we're going to talk about Hitler and the Nazi war machine and their invasion of the rest of Europe once again 20 years later, basically. So Woodrow Wilson kind of goes on a victory tour then around Europe to try and hammer out a treaty, and Wilson, because America comes in the ninth inning and kind of saves the day for the good guys. America and Woodrow Wilson are treated like heroes. And you can see here, there's American flags being hung everywhere. There's girls wearing American flag clothing. They're dropping rose petals and stuff like that at Wilson's feet. That's pretty much everywhere he goes. This changes very quickly because Wilson was a very good public speaker, but he turns out to be not only a really bad president, but a really bad diplomat. And so, all those 14 points, it just turns out to be fiction. When he starts hammering out this agreement, he tosses everybody under the bus then. So he hammers out the Treaty of Versailles, which the other countries agree to, and then he has to come home. And the Senate, of course, they have the power under the Constitution to ratify the treaty. And as is the case throughout a good portion of American history, the Senate is fairly evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. And even though the Democrats had a majority in the Senate, you need 2/3 to ratify a treaty. And so, if Wilson was going to get the Treaty of Versailles ratified by America, by the Senate, then he needed bipartisan support, and he was not going to get it. The political cartoon shows, the Republican hostiles, attacking Woodrow Wilson. They weren't against the Treaty of Versailles; they were against the League of Nations. And the reason why they were against the League of Nations is they felt that America was tearing up its constitution by submitting to a higher power, right? Also, you're throwing the Monroe Doctrine and the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine under the bus as well if you form the League of Nations, because what you're doing is you're saying that there is this governing body that is higher than America and could potentially force America to send troops or money or both into a conflict across the world. And the Republicans were unwilling to agree to that. So they blocked it, right? They just kept blocking it. Woodrow Wilson he had to kind of then try and drum up support in America, but he still had to go to Europe and deal with Germany, Austria, right, France, Belgium, Great Britain, as they all had their own individual concerns with the Treaty of Versailles. So he's trying to, hammer out an agreement between the foreign combatants and the domestic combatants, and it turned out to be too much for him. There's a cartoon from your book. It has here Woodrow Wilson and Uncle Sam basically marrying the bride of foreign entanglements. You can see the good book there that the minister's reading is the League of Nations, and then you have the stereotypical part of every wedding: if any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him speak now. And bursting through the window is the U.S. Senate. He would be a Republican, probably Henry Cabot Lodge, clutching constitutional rights there. It's a pretty cool political cartoon. So Wilson attempts to do what Teddy Roosevelt did so effectively, and that's use the bully pulpit. And so he went on a tour around the country in 1919, attempting to drum up public support for the Treaty of Versailles. And his hope was that the American public then would put pressure on their Republican senators to support the treaty. It turned out to be too much for him, and he had a stroke, and he collapsed on September 25th, 1919. And really for the rest of his presidency, which is about 11 months, 12 months or so, he was pretty much confined to a bed. I forget what side, the left side, the right side of his body was basically paralyzed, and he couldn't engage in really any more public activities. And I don't even think that he was the president in name only at that point. So what the Republicans did then, because they didn't have to deal with his opposition, is they added a bunch of earmarks and amendments to the bill that ratified the Treaty of Versailles. And it took out things that America would not be obligated to send troops and a bunch of other stuff too. So the bill, as it was finally put up for vote, looked very, very different than the treaty that was submitted to Congress initially. by Woodrow Wilson. So apparently, even though he was in bed and kind of out of it, Woodrow Wilson instructed the Democrats, and probably this was done by the Democrats themselves. They ended up voting against the treaty because of all the amendments. So this is the kind of the ironic thing and the unique thing that happens in American politics, and it happened just not too long ago, where the party that submits the bill ends up voting against their own bill, right? Because this was a Democrat president who submits the bill to Congress to be ratified, and then he instructs his own party to vote against the treaty. So that's, of course, what they do, and that essentially kills the Treaty of Versailles. So we never do ratify the Treaty of Versailles. We never do become a part of the League of Nations. And when historians play the what-if game, they think that action helped cause World War II, which I think is BS. And then the last slide of the lecture here, you can see that in 1917 Germany resumes unrestricted submarine warfare. You get the Zimmermann Note. You get the Espionage Act of 1917. The United States enters the war. You get the Bolshevik Revolution. That was a big year, 1917. Then you get 1918. Wilson proposes the 14 points. You get the Sedition Act. You have these battles, and we'll talk in class about trench warfare. You don't really have to memorize the names of any of these battles. And I'm going to try and attach something to the very end of this lecture, which didn't work last time. But the next slide, if it works, just pay attention to it. It's like a little treat. And then you get the armistice in 1918, 1919 that ends World War I. You get the big flu epidemic. You get the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, and then you get Wilson's pro-League tour and his collapse. You also get the Prohibition Amendment is passed in 1919. I didn't talk about that. And then 1920, the final Senate defeat of the Versailles Treaty, along with women's suffrage in the 19th Amendment. And that is it.
In a foreign field he lay, lonely soldier, unknown grave. On his dying words he prays, tell the world of Passchendaele. We live all that he's been through, last communion of his soul. Rust your bullets with his tears, let me tell his years. The spirit on the wind, across the lands beyond the hill. Friend and foe will meet again, those who died at Passchendaele.